Fantastic. What a great analogy and lots of good energy and enthusiasm to get us going this morning. So our third and final speaker in this block is Kim Good. And Kim Good is the Regional Manager of the Natural Resources Adelaide Mount Lofty. And he has a long professional and distinguished career working with government and community to engage in decision-making for conservation for our environment and the preservation for productive natural landscapes. His career is also underpinned by a love of and a clear passion for water. And this includes working in the engineering. I'll just wait and pause. A good reminder here at this point in time. Don't know if anyone else just heard a mobile phone go off, so if everyone can turn their mobile phones to silent, that would be great. So I'll just go back to the beginning of that. So Kim has a career that is underpinned by a love and a clear passion for water. And this includes work in the Engineering and Water Supplies Department in the South Australian Government and water quality work in the Riverland in the early 1980s. In 1998, Kim helped establish and became the Chief Executive of the Northern Adelaide and Barossa Catchment Water Management Board. And in 2005, he moved to the Management Board, the Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges Management Board, as General Manager, where he was appointed Regional Manager in 2011. I've had the pleasure of working with Kim for 3 years in the Northern Adelaide area, and again on and off over a period of about 10 years. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Kim to speak to us today about collaborations for environmental stewardship and landscape sustainability. I'm going to try and say that again, landscape sustainability. Please welcome Kim.
Thanks, Leanne. I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners of the land that we meet on today and acknowledge their ongoing and deep connection with the land and with elders past and present. Congratulations to all of the award winners. It sounds, last night sounded like a fantastic event, and each of the people, no doubt, were really worthy winners. So congratulations. It's that effort that really together keeps us doing what we're doing. It's the passion that we need in this business to keep on going. Really pleased to see Paul Ryan here. A lot of I'm going to go off on a tangent in a while in my talk about planning. And a lot of our thinking in planning has been shaped by Paul's thinking and the Resilience Alliance. So good to see Paul, and I hope some complimentary messages. And last but not least, Lucy Hyde, our regional Landcare facilitator, helped put some of this stuff together. So thanks, Lucy, for that. So what I thought I'd do is a really brief outline of some of the achievements, some of the great history of Landcare in South Australia. Note the changes through time, but I want to weave a thread into my discussion which is about people and the landscapes and the collaboration that we need to maintain both, very much along the lines that Matthew was speaking of. There's an inextricable link between our communities and the landscapes in which they live. I'll take a tangent on NRM planning to try and illustrate that planning to maintain the ecology, the biodiversity of landscapes needs to include planning on the social aspects, the community aspects of managing the landscape. And I want to tell you just a little bit about how we're doing that. Hopefully, by the end of this, we can paint a pretty optimistic picture that we're learning as we're doing. We're getting better and better. We do go through cycles. There are ups and downs, but what we have learnt and what we're putting out onto the ground, I think now is as good as we've done, and I think there's a lot more to come if we stay optimistic and positive. So, Landcare. Now, you guys know much more about this than me. You've experienced it out on the ground, and Ruth gave a good outline. But Landcare, without doubt, has added great value to South Australian landscape and to the people and the community within South Australia. So, my view is Landcare is here to stay. My view is that governments at all levels, of all colours, are committed to that. That fluctuates, and we might have arguments about that and see it slightly differently. But I think there's a long track record of government wanting to connect with community. How well it's done it over the time has absolutely varied, but I think there's a commitment. You know, that commitment, in my view, is absolutely essential, and my part in government is to continue to lobby to make sure we don't miss the people within the landscape. So we know that Decade of Landcare started in the 1990s, Australian government programs throughout that period of time. You won't see many of the things on the timeline here, but we've gone from the Natural Heritage Trust versions 1 and 2, gone into caring for our country, and more recently into the National Landcare Program. Along that timeline, and way before the start there in 1986, we've had a bundle of legislation that guides the way government makes an effort to look after the land. I reckon there's two lessons out of all of this for me when I reflect back on the history. As governments have tried to make wise investments with taxpayers' funds, as they've developed business plans and priorities, they've often caused a disconnect. So people working on a local patch that they have incredible passion for might not have been in the business plan if you're sitting in Canberra and worried about where the taxpayers' money goes. So my reflection over the last 15, 20 years is that as governments have tried their hardest to make wise investments, they've also contributed to a disconnect from time to time. What's important about acknowledging that is if we understand that and we start to understand it within government but within the community as well, we will be able to adapt to that. We'll be able to look at the signals and make change. And I want to talk a little bit more about how we do that. The other thing to note, of course, is that the government changes. Government changes at Australian, state, local level. Where they invest their money changes, how they plan changes. Again, I think we need to understand as best we can these changes and position ourselves within them. So, before I move on, I just wanted to acknowledge tremendous range of activity and great take-up of Landcare in South Australia. Tremendous effort by community groups that should be acknowledged and very, very much appreciated. But I want to go to what the future might look like for Landcare and for government in connecting with communities. I just wanted to talk about the challenges I think that we face. So this thread of the landscapes and people that I want to bring into the discussion. We've changed the way we plan to look after the ecology, the biodiversity within our landscapes. Hopefully that change will make it more meaningful for people and the community that live within the landscapes. So I'm going to talk about that planning for a little while, but then also talk about the commitment I see by government at different levels to ensure that we have regard for the local issues, the local priorities of people. So in planning, we would have traditionally looked at a piece of land like this in the Adelaide Hills, and we would have talked to the family on the farm about perhaps their irrigation efficiency. It might have been pest, plants and animals, perhaps the potential for soil erosion on that farm, maybe farm productivity, and that's been our traditional approach. We would assist around those science disciplines that we know about. In more recent times, we're drawing back and we're taking a look at the landscape that surrounds that farm and recognising the biophysical and social connections that farming family might have. So that farm exists in a much broader landscape, surrounded by, in this case, native vegetation, but no doubt the water that flows off that farm will flow down the hill and into a stream. That stream will flow across, in this case, the city of Adelaide and out into the Gulf. So at this scale, at this landscape scale, we're concerned with terrestrial health and the health of that individual farm, but more broadly terrestrial health. We're concerned with the aquatic health of the stream, the watercourse as it flows through the city, and then of course the marine environment. So we're trying to look at a much larger scale and make connections about the threats and the positive management interventions that we can invest in to maintain landscape health, aquatic health and the health of the coast and marine environment. So at a much broader scale. And the way we do that is to think of any particular landscape. The colours are pretty shocking there, so let me just explain the middle line. A landscape, terrestrial landscape, will exist in a good state or poor state, or perhaps somewhere in between. That's what that middle line is about. On the bottom line in red are the threats to the condition of that landscape. So they might be threats by pest, plants and diseases. They might be a broad range of other threats. So what can we do to minimise those threats? On the top side, we've got the positive management interventions. What can we do to transition, to move the landscape from a poor state to a better state? The importance of thinking about these things and documenting this approach is coming back to Paul's cycle. We've got a way to adaptively manage. We've got a way where we say we're going to manage this threat, or we're going to cause a positive intervention because we think it will lead the system to a better state. Our job then is to implement, to look at what we've done. Did it have the effect that we wanted it to have, that we thought it would have? If it did, let's do more of it. If it didn't, let's unpack that and see why, and perhaps change and do something different. So we've got a range of biophysical models, as I've said, terrestrial landscape health, aquatic health, and coast and marine health. But we also have a number of social models. This is where we start to weave communities and people into our thinking. And I'll come back to those social models in a minute. The objective here at working at this scale and including people in our landscape planning is that we're starting to think about not just the landscapes, but the lifestyles and the livelihoods of the people within the landscape. Let me just flip across now to our community, to the people in the the landscape. As part of our planning now, we're looking at a much lower scale. So instead of thinking the Adelaide and Mount Lofty Ranges region exists as just one big homogeneous region, which is illogical and we know it doesn't, we've split the region up into 7 sub-regions. And I'll just concentrate on a couple during my talk. But we've come down to that scale so that we can better understand what's driving the communities at that scale. What's the local economy? What are the local social networks at that level? What's important to them in the landscape that they live in? And let me just give you and when you go to that scale, not surprisingly, and as members of various community groups, you would understand this, but what you find when you go down to that scale is the tremendous diversity that we need to take into account if we're going to be successful. So let me just give you an example. The Northern Adelaide Plains, Virginia, up to Malala and almost Port Wakefield in our region. It looks something like this. We've got intensive horticulture. As you move out, head up to Malala and Port Wakefield, we get into dry land agriculture, particularly cereal production. Interestingly, we've got a tremendous multicultural community, particularly around the market gardening areas of Virginia. Now let me compare that with the region just next door, what we call Barossa Valley, or the Northern Hills part of the Mount Lofty Ranges. No surprise, Barossa Valley, viticulture, a little bit of dairying left, and on the fringes and the northern fringes of the Barossa, some of that cereal production. The interesting part about these two regions, or sub-regions, sit right next door to one another, not 20 minutes in a car from the centre of one to the centre of another. But the diversity of the people is incredible. So I mentioned in the Virginia area, the Northern Adelaide Plains, we've got our most recent immigrants from Southeast Asia. 30, 40, 50 years ago, it was a European migration and influx. Right next door, Barossa Valley, the German settlers right at settlement, moving into that area and starting viticulture. You couldn't get two more different areas, two more different communities. And the northern area, that's where my family come from, Long Plains and Lower Light, cereal production. I don't know about the families around mine, but they're still doing what they were doing when they settled also. So the contrast couldn't be more stark in such an area. And if we're planning to manage those landscapes, if we're planning for sustainable primary production and we don't understand the communities that live within those sub-regions, and if we don't treat them differently and respectfully, our outcomes on the ground are not going to be what they want. And thanks. And I'll just flick through just to continue to show you the contrast in our, Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges is one of the smallest regions in South Australia. So the Central Hills, apple, pears, cherries, and of course the metropolitan area, completely different again. So from there, I just wanted to turn back to, if the community, if people are so important, what is government doing about it? I think government, we could well argue, it's taken quite some time, but I think we could well argue that in the past government hasn't been good at this. But at a state government level, there's a commitment by the Premier to what he calls his Better Together program. That's simply what we know about as engaging people in a very genuine way. for the Premier, and this is to apply across state government. Better together looks like these principles. Engage people early, understand why you engage with them, know what you want to achieve, understand their background, their history, be genuine, be creative and engaging. So, coming back to that idea of conceptual models and how we undertake our NRM planning, we've developed models that hopefully will tell us a little bit more about the communities. So we have 4 socially based models, 3 biophysical models, our traditional NRM planning, but 4 social models. So what is it that we need to think about if we want to move people from maybe a poor understanding, maybe some understanding, to a better desired state around supporting what work we do? What are the threats to that? What are the management interventions? So we've developed a conceptual model about just broad-scale community support for NRM, more detailed models about how we build the capacity and work with the landowners, the land managers, the natural resource managers, a model around sustainable primary production, and a model about climate change. The important point here is these social models underpin, they sustain our NRM business. They will facilitate our work with the biophysical. Last 12 months, to give effect to some of this thinking, the last 12 months we worked with Leanne and Natasha Davis to engage the communities in those 7 sub-regions, to talk to them about how we could connect better as a NRM board, to take their advice and to look sub-regionally at what drove them. And that's been a fantastic exercise. A lot of work is coming out of that tells us how to do that much better. At a national level, to acknowledge the investment the Australian government provide, the National Landcare program has 4 strategic objectives. They all connect communities. So communities managing landscapes, farmers and fishers increasing long-term returns, communities more involved in caring for the environment, and communities protecting species and natural assets. So at an Australian government level, there's also this recognition that communities are critical, are a vital component of what we do. Across the 56 NRM regions in Australia, we have regional Landcare facilitators. Smiling people like this group of South Australian regional Landcare facilitators, and I imagine most of them are in the room, doing tremendous stuff to work with the communities in their regions. So where to from here? What do we draw out of this? My take-home message is, I suppose, this inextricable link between people, communities, and the landscape, I think is being recognised. Landcare, in one form or another, is here to stay. I think this community collaboration is absolutely critical to the success of governments, regardless of what program they have, regardless of what structures that they have. And both for Landcare and for government programs, we need to prepare ourselves for change. As they say, it's the only constant these days, so there's no point not thinking things will change. It's about being prepared and trying to better understand the pace of change, the character of that change. The other take-home message I'd have is that for people like NRM boards, and the other side of the coin is for Landcare, if we want to make collaboration relevant, I think it's got to be done at a local scale. We've got to think about not just the landscape, but the livelihoods and the lifestyles, the social networks, the social systems, but the underlying economies that vary incredibly from sub-region to sub-region. I think we're better placed now than we ever have been to prepare for and manage that inevitable change that's going to occur. So thank you very much.